This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everybody to our revisitation of the Cold War, which Matthew Grant is going to be talking about citizenship in the Cold War. And I have to say, looking around at the average age of people here, quite a few of us might actually remember the Cold War. Do you remember duck and cover, folks? And you're welcome to yes, spending the Cuban Missile Crisis in the storage cupboard under our stairs. Yes. so we're going to be avidly interested in this. So
I would hold back on those hasty words. A bit of context on this. I was going to say I'm writing a book on citizenship on the Cold War, but that places a bit too much emphasis on the act of actually having written something. I intend to be writing a book on the history on citizenship in the Cold War. I have done quite a bit of work on this. In fact, I presented a paper at this very seminar several years ago on civil defence volunteers, which may make a small return into this. But basically, like most historians, when you start off a new project, you start immersing yourself in the historiography. And I began to sort of be quite concerned, well not concerned, interested about how citizenship is broken down historiographically in post-war Britain and trying to think about how the Cold War meshes with that historiography. And so this paper is an attempt to sort of unpick that for myself and for you. So if it gets... I will say that the original version of this would have meant I would have been talking for about an hour and a half. But basically that was for my own thing. And it's now cut down, so it should be a nice 45 minutes. So hopefully that's a bit more acceptable. Okay, so on the 30th of July 1950, Clement Attlee took to the radio to make an important prime ministerial broadcast. The previous month, North Korean forces had invaded the south, sparking the first hot war, if we want the temperature-related metaphors of the Cold War period, and rising and sparking fears of a global war. Attlee denounced the invasion in the strongest terms. No excuses, no propaganda. It's one of the North Korean communists coming to no excuses, no propaganda, no introduction of other questions can get over this fact. Here is a case of aggression, he said. If the aggressor gets away with it, aggressors all over the world will be encouraged. The same results which led to the Second World War will follow, and another world war may result. Make no mistake about it, the evil forces attacking South Korea are part of a worldwide conspiracy against the way of life of the free democracies. But Attlee focused mainly on the impact of this aggression for the British people. Because of the growth of evil forces in the world, he said, we now have no option but to increase our defences. His call went wider, and the Prime Minister declared all could play a part in the fight to make Britain safe by volunteering for service in the forces or the Civil Defence Service, adding that the fire that has been started in Korea may burn down your house. It may be well worthwhile now to make some sacrifice in leisure to prevent war. Finally, he added, I would ask you all to guard against the enemy within. There are those who would stop at nothing to injure our economy and our defence. The price of liberty is still internal vigilance. And the Daily Mirror had a very handy headline for this, declaring the need to serve, sacrifice and guard against the enemy within. Now, Attlee's call for a patriotic response to the Cold War built on some basic assumptions about the nature of British society and citizen-state relations in the immediate post-war period. Namely, that the individuals would be willing to serve in the nation against an enemy, and that they'd be equally willing to make the necessary sacrifices, both in economic terms and in individual leisure. And there was a fundamental belief in the political loyalty that would guard against the communist threat to the British nation. And these assumptions underpinned the three main ways the state asked individual citizens to participate in the Cold War from the late 40s. Firstly, all young men were liable to military conscription at the age of 18. And conscription remained in place throughout the 1950s, with a generation of young men serving and at times fighting in the defence of British national interests. Secondly, the government asked people to volunteer for the civil defence services that had been re-established in 1949, and around 500,000 people had done so by the end of 1944, and over half of them were women. Finally, the government called on people to show political loyalty and resist communism at home as well as abroad, part of a complex policy of anti-communism that had some profound consequences for individuals in Cold War Britain. So that's my sort of setting the scene for the Cold War. Citizenship is obviously one of the most important themes of post-war British history. As a way of framing questions relating to the basic, interrelate actions between individuals and the state and between individuals and society, citizenship has obviously become essential to understanding the modern British past. But what historians mean by citizenship, however, is often very widely diffuse, and nor are historians alone in having a very liberal understanding of what citizenship can mean. Not for nothing did Ruth Lister note that citizenship runs the danger of meaning what people choose it to mean. Citizenship can, does, and has meant very different things to very different people, ranging from a very precise understanding of a legal status, ranging to a much more broader sense of how individuals interact with each other and indeed the state. And certainly historians have used it in a variety of senses. But for it to have any meaning, for us, analytically, and if historians are to be able to use it to understand aspects of the past in the historical context, there needs to be, I think, a workable definitional core of what citizenship is, which allows the various understandings of citizenship to be used in a way that retains some degree of precision rather than just being unmanageably malleable. So fundamentally then, this is heavily influenced by Ruth Lister, citizenship is obviously both a status and a practice. People are born into, are awarded or achieve citizenship status, but through their everyday interactions they practice citizenship. Equally importantly, citizenship is both a relationship between citizen and state, but also between citizens, and that this is not one relationship, but a series of them, and meanings ascribed to those relationships can differ dramatically according to who is viewing, describing, or experiencing them. A multiplicity of activities, events, laws, behaviours can therefore be deemed to impinge on or be an example of citizenship, and this wide range is reflected in both the use of the concept in political and social discourse, both historically and today, and in the scholarly literature on the topic. Moreover, what the status of citizenship actually entails, or what the practice of citizenship actually involves, can be and is defined in many ways. So that's a not particularly sharp definition, but a very broad one. And the task is for historians, though, is to ensure that this definitional core is mapped onto the contours of the past, and that the vast range of activities, ideas, values and behaviours are examined in any given society and at every given time in order to understand what citizenship was. So my call is for a historically specific understanding of citizenship rather than a normative one, which I might return to. By placing historical and cultural specificity at the heart of any analysis of citizenship, we can understand how it was understood and experienced at given points and how it changed over time. Okay, so the paper aims then to explore how we can historicise citizenship using this definitional core. It focuses on three different registers of citizenship, as I call it. Firstly, there's the discussion of how citizens have analysed formal citizenship as a political legal framework. Secondly, there's a discussion of what we can call differentiated citizenship, particularly on the creation of good citizens, on debates about how citizenship can be enhanced or improved, how citizenship can be taught. Often with a particular emphasis on voluntary action, obviously, or engagement. And thirdly, I examine perhaps the broadest understanding of citizenship that's been used by historians, that of belonging to a constructed national community. These three registers illustrate the wide uses of the term and reflect its importance as both status and practice. The approaches within them are different, sometimes very radically so, but what I want to emphasise is I don't think they're contradictory necessarily. Following my historiographical discussion of these registers, the final section of the paper will explore how we can usefully combine the registers into a synthetic approach. And this must adhere to a definitional core, but it must include the fundamental ways citizenship was understood in its historical context. It can't leave any of them behind, it can't exclude any of them. And finally, I argue, as I would, being a Cold War historian, that the Cold War is very important to understanding citizenship after 1945. Okay, so the first register takes its starting point at the inclusion of sections in the population within the pale of formal citizenship, i.e. the political legal framework between citizens and state, which is enshrined in both rights and obligations. Now, for historians of the early 20th century, this naturally has led onto an emphasis on voting rights. Becoming a mass democracy, though, in the interwar period, although I would argue only in the 1940s at the end of plural voting, as I keep banging on to my students, although none of them care. But basically, I don't think this led to any real slackening of the interest in formal citizenship, although focus is given over to two key areas. The first is the concept of social citizenship, and the second is the way non-white immigrants have been included or excluded as formal citizens. Both of these areas have illustrated the continuing importance of this formal framework, but raise key issues about how citizenship is experienced and how ideas of citizenship have changed. Okay, so social citizenship obviously is integral to debate, has been integral to debates about citizenship since the end of the Second World War, building on obviously T.H. Marshall's theory, expounded in 1949, and in addition to the legal and political rights, citizens are also entitled to social rights, as he called them, especially access to welfare benefits. And although much sociological work has placed an emphasis on discussing social rights, Marshall did obviously argue that citizens received rights, as he put it, conditional only on the discharge of the general duties of citizenship. And as many people have noted, William Beveridge also firmly believed in the obligations as well as the rights when dealing with welfare provision. Although his more contractarian, voluntarist vision of social insurance was, we can probably argue, rejected in favour of a slightly more rights-based approach by the Attlee government. So such a notion of formal citizenship and social citizenship clearly rests on what duties or obligations actually are, if rights are tied to obligations. General duties of citizenship, however, is a remarkably vague term for describing how someone is accorded citizenship rights. What are these general duties? Who decides what they are? As Lydia Morris has powerfully argued, what those general duties are deemed to be has in fact served to undermine social citizenship in the post-war period. The example she provides is the renewed emphasis on the unemployed to prove their right to benefits in the 1980s, a process which she has described as involving a discouraging, demoralising and humiliating procedure. But that procedure, she argues, is construed as one of the duties of the citizen who's asking for welfare benefits. In essence, then, the very concept of citizenship obligations has changed over time through the interplay of policy and public attitudes to unemployment. Citizenship rights, therefore, might be a status enshrined by the law, but those rights since 1945 have been circumscribed by citizenship practice, which is dynamic and changeable. So the second focus of work on formal citizenship has been immigration and race. And some of the most vibrant and vital work on the issue of citizenship has tackled how non-white people in Britain and the Empire were included or excluded as British citizens in the legal sense through the implementation of a wide range of legislation from the 1948 British Nationality Act onwards. I think this work is crucial for understanding the impact of legislation on citizenship, as in political imperatives could serve to strip away rights from groups of citizens. And a more fluid conception of citizenship emerges that illustrates that although non-white people may have had the status of formal citizens in the 50s and 60s, they were not treated as such, either politically or socially. And this difference between status and the practice of citizenship is of crucial importance. For example, James Hampshire has discussed the difference between belonging and non-belonging citizens. He describes them. But argues against the idea that citizenship simply is full membership of a community, which entails a full sense of belonging by self and others. And Hampshire's insistence on discussing citizenship as a legal status but not a substantive ideal makes sense from a legal and constitutional perspective, but I'm not sure it correlates to how citizenship and citizen were used, understood and experienced in Britain in the 40s, 50s and 60s. The rise of Powellism in the late 60s and early 70s, for example, illustrated in graphic terms the stark attitudes towards non-white people that were widespread among the working class white population, and that these ideas were underpinned by assumptions about whiteness, disorder, but also a basic sense about who deserved to both reside in the country and have access to its resources. And such attitudes had resulted, obviously, in direct discrimination throughout the post-war period, restricting access to the basic necessities of life, such as housing and employment. And I think this is the crux of the formal citizenship issue. If a group of citizens are being separated out because they are perceived in parts of political and popular culture as not belonging, and they're experiencing direct discrimination because of it, how can they be counted as citizens in the fullest sense of the word of how people understood it in this period? If the obligations of citizenship have often appeared as a negative way of limiting rights, whether of the unemployed or of the black immigrant, examining citizenship through the prism of the Cold War can help us understand how central duty was to citizenship in the period. And national service, I think, is the most obvious way the Cold War impinged on the lives of the British. In fact, it could be said that national service was the most obvious way the British state affected the lives of the public, full stop, in the 1950s. I mean, 2.4 million men served in the military in the 1950s, and the justification for compulsory national service, I think, is a classic example of the state's view of what it could expect of citizens after the end of the Second World War and the calls it could make on society. Basically, the state's right to the military service of young men was almost completely taken for granted, and research I've done, it's very rarely questioned. There's a fundamental assumption that young men should provide such service if the state needed it. Myself and a colleague have been conducting an oral history project with ex-national servicemen. One of them told us, on being asked what he thought about national service, said, I think I just thought, oh well, the government says I've got to do it, so I've got to do it. As Richard Vinan has shown us, the 50s wore on. I think there is change over time here. There was a growing reluctance to accept the obligation of military service, and this was often articulated in terms of utility, with military wastefulness compared to economic usefulness. People were becoming increasingly anti-military as well. But in general, it's expressed in terms of a more private, personal citizenship, of personal development and fulfilment, and national service being a waste of time. So national service can serve as a case study to understand how formal obligations, the legal status of citizenship for young men, played out after 45. Okay, so the second register now. This is the emphasis on the differential quality of citizenship, and in particular on what's often called active citizenship, which I suspect most people in this room might know more about than me. It's often firmly rooted in the assumption, so different from the first register, that formal citizenship is only part of the story, and that rather than being solely a status, citizenship is also a variable practice. Primarily, it's based on the concept of good or active citizens. Active citizens, it's argued, improve society and political discourse, and is of normal benefit for both the individual and the wider polity and society. It's obviously a very traditional way of understanding citizenship. It's the Republican model, really, and is opposed to the passive citizenship, the enjoyment of rights without the undertaking of the work of citizenship, as it were. And historical attention has understandably focused far more on the extent to which active citizenship has existed and how it was promoted, and today it's been slightly less concerned with how it was experienced and its wider consequences for promoting a differentiated concept of citizenship. Now, there's no way to criticise the excellent work on voluntary action and active citizenship, which has gone a long way to correct long-held assumptions about the decline of participation, the paucity of voluntarism, and the basic aims and thought of many of the pioneers of the welfare state. It has emphasised the vibrancy of a range of organisations throughout the post-war and the role that they have had, often in tandem with the state rather than opposed to it. I think it's really corrected this idea that the state took over and there was just this decline in activism. I think that's important to bear in mind. But I think the emphasis on voluntary action has raised the crucial issue concerning the perceived worth of the volunteering active citizen. Namely, are they better citizens than passive ones who don't volunteer? And recent scholarship has decisively shown that that was an assumption throughout the post-1945 period on behalf of thinkers. Social theorists have long considered voluntarism as one of the fullest expression of being a citizen. And there's been a general tendency in some of the historiography to assume that the British public were increasingly apathetic after 1945 to the detriment of the quality of political life. Although there has been recently renewed attempts to rethink what's meant by political participation by a range of historians, for example, recent work on NGOs by Matthew Hill and the team surrounding that project. And the work of investigating active citizenship and participation are really echoing this understanding of citizenship, which is of central importance in post-war Britain, that it's differentiated. Some people are better citizens, they just participate more, and that's a good thing than others. And I think there are a couple of major interlinked questions which I think we have to think about as historians arising from this. First is the question of agency. How did people interact with and influence these ideas of citizenship? And secondly is the links one about apparently passive citizens. Agency is crucial to active citizenship. It's a theory based on individual and collective participation after all. And we now have, due to excellent history, a deep and rich understanding of the structures of the voluntary sector and people's people's activities within that, within those structures. But I think perhaps we need more of an almost Thompsonian history of citizenship from below, dealing with people's, putting individuals centre stage and understanding how they challenged ideas a bit more, understood the world around them and worked within organisations. I think there is a lot of work on that on voluntary action, but obviously I read a lot of the work on voluntary action thinking only about citizenship, chasing different foxes, and obviously working at different things. I think this challenge presented by the work to sort of structural accounts of the kind of activism can be taken up with an emphasis on agency, putting the interactions of people within those organisations and individual conceptions of and challenges to citizenship can sort of make us think a bit more about citizenship in the round. And passivity is linked to this. Ruth List has argued that acting as a citizen involves fulfilling the full potential of the status, but those who don't fulfil that potential do not cease to be citizens. But you have to think more about what about those people who don't participate, and I don't just mean people who can't participate for structural economic reasons, but those who choose not to participate. Passivity is seen as a negative quality and is seen to have increased with affluence and the growth of more home-based and family-oriented modes of leisure. But little thought has been given to its implications for citizenship. It could be argued, and a lot of people would have argued in the 50s, that passivity was actually part of a contractarian concept of citizenship. Individuals who fulfilled what they considered to be their social roles, motherhood, work, paying tax, obeying the law, could be said to be good citizens despite their lack of voluntary action or formal activism. It's certainly doubtful that those people themselves would have thought themselves of anything less. I think very few people think of themselves as a bad citizen, do they? Everyone's a good citizen in their way. But I don't think enough is known yet about the idea of citizenship at that level at different historical moments of how ordinary people understood their own obligations to state and society, or what citizenship meant at the level of the family. And I think studying the Cold War encourages the historian to interrogate these issues in a number of ways. The Cold War, in its domestic British sense, was an activist conflict. As Attlee's call made clear, the government recruited civil defence volunteers from 1949 until the organisation was scrapped in 1968. And as such, the organisation and its members allows us to understand active citizenship, how it was understood within a ideological, patriotic organisation. But once the analytical frame shifts to volunteers themselves, we see the complexities of the period coming through. The desire to help the nation in its defence was there, but it coexisted more on emphasis on the local community, the desire to have somewhere to play table tennis, a pronounced love of uniforms and fire engines for some of the people involved, and also I believe there was very little else to do in certain villages in the countryside. Basically, that's my analysis of why people join civil defence. It's very often not patriotic. But beyond civil defence, the Cold War highlights how citizenship could be understood and articulated in very different ways from that proposed by the government and the vast majority of the media in the Cold War. Members of both the Communist Party of Great Britain and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament articulated visions of active citizenship which were based on very different moral and political basis from that of the overarching Cold War. But they shared a belief also in the individual's role in shaping society as part of a community of like-minded activists. They were internationalists, committed to overturning the political structures of the day, but Cold War dissidents could in one way be seen as archetypal active citizens, of course. But they were practising an oppositional, unpatriotic citizenship at a time when national unity and defence were heavily stressed. In short, they were attempting to remake citizenship for their own purposes, make sense of it in their own lives. And also I think the Cold War can help us approach passivity in a different way. Traditionally considered as a regression into the home or a political retreat into the television, the Cold War may help us understand apparent passivity as a more conscious choice. Civil defence, the Communist Party, C&D were all engaged in fighting the Cold War, but it may have been the case that many people believed that the Cold War couldn't be fought. Superpower rivalry could seem distant and uncontrollable, and the threat of nuclear war likewise for many seemed as something irresolvable by individual action. And certainly the idea that nuclear war could actually be survived was a very, very minority opinion by the end of the 1950s. In this sense, then, passivity in the Cold War could be seen to be a conscious choice born out of fatalism and powerlessness. And likewise, there are concerns that the psychological consequences of living under the shadow of the bomb may have led to quietism and disengagement as a sort of form of survival strategy in the face of a threat that could be barely imagined. And so we can help us think about passivity as this psychological way of survival. Okay, so the third register of citizenship examines a wider process of inclusion and exclusion in a national community. Seeing citizenship in this way is far removed from the first register in terms of its inclusivity and lack of formal process, and very different from the second register in that it seems to refuse to define citizenship in terms of behaviour or quality. Such a broad understanding of citizenship as belonging to a national community does raise questions about whether citizenship retains any analytical meaning once you get to such a broad level. And we can certainly see there has been a tendency among some historians to align citizenship with national identity, as though they're unproblematic terms. But defining citizens as those belonging to a national community does mean concentrating as much on exclusion as inclusion. Historians have long seen the process of building national identity as defining it against the values and characteristics of others outside the nation. And citizenship in this sense can be seen to have been defined in similar ways, creative positively in terms of the values possessed by citizens, but also negatively in terms of certain characteristics, values and behaviours not possessed. Anyone who does possess those supposedly negative qualities can be stigmatised as a bad citizen and excluded from the constructed national community. In short, not to be a citizen at all in that sense. And this view is obviously built on the approaches and techniques of cultural history, and particularly the belief in the cultural construction of identities through the play and interplay of discourse. In this sense, citizenship becomes a fluid formation, defined and redefined in different contexts and excluding different groups and different times. Perhaps the archetypal historian who used this is Sonia Rose, his work on the Second World War. And she's argued that citizenship may be usefully defined as a discursive framework explicating the judicial relationship between the people and the political community, and stressed that during the Second World War, good citizenship was seen as a voluntary fulfilment of obligations and willingness to contribute to the welfare of the community. I mean, actually, lots of people would argue that's a pretty good definition of a good citizen today. But central to Rose's argument is that in the war years, this definition was elevated through political rhetoric and propaganda to a point where those who were not good citizens were seen as failing to contribute to the war effort. Such good citizenship became deeply entrenched enough to form a national myth about British participation and self-sacrifice in the war years. And within popular culture, good citizenship was promoted partly through positive stories praising heroism and self-sacrifice, but also through identifying and stigmatising the behaviour of bad citizens. So labelling bad citizens serves not only to inspire renewed good citizenship, but to recalibrate perceived normal behaviour as the everyday actions of good citizens. After 1945, it's clear that citizenship was indeed considered by many to consist of belonging to a national community. To give some examples, the debate about problem families or the underclass from the 1950s onwards highlights that those seen as not adhering to certain standards have indeed been stigmatised as bad citizens. Abigail Wills' work on delinquency has shown that in the 50s delinquent had been deemed to have failed in his obligations to an organic community which had the right to cast him out symbolically until he fulfilled the requirements that allowed him to return. But if overly narrow definitions of citizenship that I've spoken about before are unhelpful, the broader understanding of citizenship as belonging raises two really important questions about exclusion. First, what's the meaning of exclusion in this sense? And secondly, by what processes does exclusion occur? I mean, central to this is the issue, I suppose, about whether rhetorical attacks or discursive exclusion can be seen to contravene citizenship. People excluded in that way, we could argue, can still vote, still have access to justice, have the same rights as anyone else. how are they not citizens? There's natural criticism of that. I think it does matter because attacks on belonging can have direct social consequences, as the history of racism in Britain shows, and it matters because the assumptions about the nature of rights and obligations fundamentally do underpin real assaults on rights, as can be seen in the welfare reforms of the 1980s. What these duties and obligations changed over time. Duties and obligations change over time, and state policy is not created in a vacuum, but part of a circulating set of cultural and political assumptions and values. And so the discursive nature of citizenship, I think, does matter. But how exclusion occurs, I think, is vital to the issue. I think it's a question that hinges on the link between representation and experience. Sonia Rose saw the specific nature of discussion on citizenship in the Second World War as a hegemonic discourse in Gramscian terms, which permeated popular culture and excluded that way. The key here is how individuals make sense of this discursive nature of citizenship. For Rose, their reactions were analysed through that hegemonic prism. Discourse at the level of political and popular culture led to this hegemonic narrative, and people reacted to and within it. Now, Rose's examination of the relationship between citizenship, discourse and experience, I think, is immensely important, but I don't think it emphasises agency enough. There's very little sense in her work of people establishing different modes of citizenship, but rather she has them only working within the discourse. And I think we must bear in mind that people aren't just blank subjects living out linguistic codes that have been spotted by historians. I think that's a bit of an issue. Rose, however, has convincingly argued for the importance of moral discourse in the labelling of bad citizens, and this is immense importance because it does highlight the difference between citizenship as belonging on the one hand and national identity on the other, and I think it helps keep those separate. And although closely linked, citizenship in this register is as much about people being excluded for their perceived behaviour as it is their ethnic or national characteristics, and I think that's quite important. Political and press campaigns demonising certain sections of the population, I think, do impinge on citizenship, but not enough has been devoted yet onto the question of how the bad citizen understood citizenship themselves or their own place within the supposedly hegemonic narrative. And I think the gap between labelling and the people being labelled is one that is quite difficult to bridge, but I think it's one we need to attempt to. We need to pay some key attention to the methodological issues, engaging the impact between representation on the one side and experience on the other. Certainly we need to bear in mind that citizens as individuals or groups practice citizenship in their own way, and in doing so contribute to wider rhetorics and even laws. And any analysis of citizenship, I think, has to be rooted in experience and social relationships, not just this popular discourse. Discourse is important, but we need to understand its relationship and experience and agency is a two-way street. I think the Cold War is illuminating here, but then I would. I think anti-communism is a paradigmatic example of how formal, indeed active citizens, communists, could be excluded from the national community. They were stigmatised as an enemy within, as exactly explained as I read out at the first. Anti-communism, although not even coming close to the levels experienced in the United States in the 50s, could be seen in government purges of the civil service in Britain, expulsions from trade unions, and even in the Boy Scouts, in a very good article. To understand this, we must examine anti-communism discursively, how are anti-communist ideas formed and circulated. But to measure the impact of anti-communism, we must also understand its political and ideological role in the Cold War, its impact on the lives of communists, and how communists argued against it. We must also not fall into the trap of considering it hegemonic. Communists not only resisted anti-communist discourse, but articulated their own ideas of citizenship. When, for example, the John Lewis Partnership attempted to force all its employees in all its department stores to sign an anti-communist pledge in 1950, I might have started that in the future, because that's a good thing. It actually received widespread ridicule. I mean, the Labour Party, the Labour government didn't support it. The press didn't support it. It just seemed. And there's a very good piece in the Daily Mirror. It doesn't matter if a communist sells me a lampshade. It's just not that. It just doesn't matter. So I think there's a limit here to the anti-communist discourse. Anti-communism, though, was one way about the proper relationship between citizen and state. It could be conceived, one among many. Its importance lies in the fact that it did shape people's lives, either directly or indirectly, through limiting political choice. But we can only understand this if we examine what people wrote, said, or have remembered about it. It's not the same as understanding people's subjectivities, although it does involve individual reactions to and understandings of citizenship. And I don't think this is a minor issue. The emphasis on subjectivities suggests that historians can discover what people really felt or thought about an issue. And searching, I don't think, I think that's a methodological question that's slightly more important than me talking about it here. But searching for people's interactions with citizenship ideas and how they practice citizenship, I think, relies on something that's more knowable than that. I think we have to seek something that's more knowable, i.e. how people articulated citizenship and practiced it in relation to the state and their fellow citizens. Now, what I want to stress is that I don't think any of these registers I've outlined are incorrect. Far from it. All the historians my work is implicitly spoken about, and these examples I've cut out. I've answered valid historical questions and tackled an aspect of citizenship which is of fundamental importance to modern British history. But to fully understand citizenship as a topic in itself, I think, in its historical context, does need a synthetic approach that takes into account all three registers, understanding that they coexist and overlap rather than compete. Formal citizenship enshrined by political, legal and social rights was the bedrock of ideas of citizenship, as was for many the idea that voluntarism and other sorts of activism was the hallmark of a good citizen. And finally, a variety of factors could lead some sections of the community being labelled as bad citizens. Historicising citizenship also needs to be sympathetic to sociological approaches, while at the same time maintaining an emphasis on historical contingency. Historians have often make use of normative ideas of citizenship, but I think it's important to break free of the limited impact of treating it in this way, because citizenship then risks becoming solely an analytical tool, a normative measure of social and political relationships that allows us to interrogate the past. The task for the historian, I think, though, is to make it more than that. And given that citizenship is used and has been used in widely different ways, our starting point should always be how citizenship was understood and practiced at any given moment by a range of actors. And I fully realise the irony of me speaking for around 35-40 minutes and not doing that, and talking about mainly normative things, but that's what I should be doing. And as I say to my students, do as I say and not as I do is not a number one rule. An emphasis on historical specificity will also allow us to understand how citizenship changed in the post-45 Cold War period, because change it certainly did. Citizenship clearly didn't mean the same things to people in 1980, say, as it did in 1945. And this change can be seen across all three registers. And by understanding the importance of change, can we then ask questions about how and why it changed? And these questions will tackle the basic relationship between citizen and the state and between citizens. And I think they're fundamental for understanding the change in British past in that post-war period. And I think answering them will go a long way to addressing the big questions about British history in the past 70 years. And accounting for this change gets to the heart of perhaps what I think is the most important methodological problem in confronting any attempt to historicise citizenship. And that's to return to the question of the interrelationship between discourse and experience. As I've said, the operation of discourse is seen to be crucial to the understanding of ideas about how citizenship were formed. But I think we must break away from the idea that symbolic representations determine experiences. Bill Schwartz's recent work on post-war race has stressed that Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, for example, marked the creation of a charged circuit of political rhetoric. But Schwartz says that it's obvious that Powell didn't create the ideas concerning race which erupted from his supporters in the aftermath of his speech. They existed previously, deeply rooted in the ideas of nation and race with long antecedents. Powell may have created the political space in which they could be articulated, but he didn't and could not have created the fears, concerns and ideas which made popular racism in 1960s Britain. These were deeply rooted in memory of war and empire. Likewise, citizenship was discussed within the symbolic frame of discourse, which limited but didn't determine citizenship experience. Discourse is dynamic, but it's also subject to change through social and political action, through the practice of citizenship. People remained agents, and citizens were present at their own creation. Thompsonian nod. To put it another way, people created their own sense of citizenship, but not in the circumstances of their own choosing. Not to another left-wing thinker. It's possible to chart citizenship across its three registers, including press and parliament, committee room, protest march, home, And I make no claim about discovering what citizens really thought and felt about the issue, but I think we can discover how people articulated what they thought and felt within the context of their relationships with state and society. And I think that's probably apt. Citizenship is about the individual's place within the wider framework of society and state, and attempting to historicise it must settle for how individuals' ideas about it were expressed in the public and social sphere, you know, in terms of words rather than sort of emotion and subjectivity, rather than, you know, just mindset. I think this approaching it like this will allow us to account for the swirl of different ideas about citizenship as a status and the different social experience of it as a practice, and it will allow us to acknowledge the structure and effects of discourse while emphasising agency and change, and hopefully, in short, it will allow us to study what citizenship was. And the place of Cold War within this is important because it shaped the status and practice of citizenship itself. Rights have been stressed more than obligations in scholarly literature on formal citizenship, but the Cold War did entrench formal obligations into the 60s, and that's not a small incidental fact, but of real importance, at a time when private concerns were meant to be uppermost in the minds of a population replete with welfare rights. All young men were subject to peacetime conscription for the first time. National service is remarkably absent from the literature on citizenship, as indeed the Cold War is more generally, and this historical opacity is central to the Cold War's importance. By shining a light on it, by investigating the Cold War obligations placed on citizens, we force a rethinking of both the place of duty within citizenship, but also the traditional narratives which have been used to account for its decline. It's not to downplay the importance of domesticity, leisure, consumption, those other narratives, but to stress that by analysing them alongside the Cold War, seeing how the two interlinked and influenced each other, we should be able to have a much more nuanced account of their operation, so rather than just, you know, consumption shaped everything. It will actually help us understand that a bit more. In the same way, the Cold War was a site of massive activism and dissent throughout the 50s and 60s, often by groups of people self-consciously articulating alternative forms of citizenship. They did this because of the urgency of the Cold War threat required them to break with notions of patriotism that were being articulated within political culture and the popular press. Cold War dissent illustrates the agency of citizens in this period, and the transformative practices of these citizens expanded the boundaries of accepted citizenship in the 50s and 60s, legitimising dissent. More generally, the Cold War helps us highlight the intensely gendered and class narratives of citizenship. Masculinity was obviously central to ideas of duty expounded in national service, and both C&D and civil defence were depicted as sites for the proper activism of feminine concern at the danger of the Cold War. Anti-communism obviously had a clean class edge, with middle-class intellectuals seen as much more traitorous than their working-class comrades. Nation and region are also incredibly important because vibrant communist cultures existed in parts of South Wales and the central bit of Scotland, and recruitment to civil defence split largely both along north-south and urban and rural lines. And the Cold War itself in Britain can only be understood by accounting for the enormous variety of citizenship practices in the period, and I think historicising citizenship in the post-war period must simply take account of the Cold War. I think it also helps us bring to the fore change, because although Cold War is often seen as a static conflict lasting sort of 40 odd years, we need to understand its peaks and troughs. There was a long period of détente between the sort of mid-60s and the end of the 70s, and in changing citizenship I think it's useful to think of that process of détente, because I think the impact of the Cold War on citizenship was limited to the sort of 45 to mid-60s period, not so much after. National service, civil defence, they were things from the first half of the Cold War. Even the organised peace movement, which was actually much bigger and really more politically engaged in the 80s than it was, I think, in the late 50s and 60s, can really be said to be working within a framework of citizenship practice established by its previous period of activity. But if the Cold War was vital to citizenship in the 60s, until the 60s, but not the 80s, what changed? Well, the Cold War changed. National service, civil defence was scrapped. C&D had declined massively from the early 60s. Splitting the Communist Party, originating in 1956, led to both the emergence of a Marxist culture not aligned to Moscow, but also the general decline of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And the Cold War, in fact, largely ceased to become a major external factor in British domestic life. Fear of war declined, the intense pressures on participating, duty and belonging declined too. And this change coincided with bigger social, political and intellectual developments which also had enormous influence on the idea of citizenship. Welfare rights, the rising critique of passivity, the intense discussion about race, all challenging ideas of citizenship. Also important was the gradual receding from memory of the Second World War, which had been perhaps the single most important factor in shaping citizenship ideas in the first decade after 45. And these trends, the decline of the Cold War and the rise of other things, corresponded and encouraged a sort of decline of messages of duty, engagement and patriotism. But how these factors related to each other can only be untangled through a lengthy research process, which I'm only really just beginning. But it seems clear that just as citizenship in the 50s was shaped intensely by the Cold War, citizenship in 1970, for example, was markedly different, both because of its absence but by the changes it had wrought. So historicising citizenship in the Cold War is complex. It may take its starting point at the definitional core of citizenship as both a status and a practice, and comprising a series of relationships between citizen and state and between citizens. From this broad starting point, it must seek to ask how citizenship was represented and experienced within its historically specific framework. Normative theories, though useful for conceptualising citizenship, must not crowd out the actual historical understanding of it. If we approach the topic in this way, I believe the three registers of citizenship will be clearly visible, embedded within the political discussion, popular culture and the social experience of the people of post-war Britain. Citizenship after 1945 can't be contained in only one of these registers. It's spilled over into all three. As we saw with Clement Attlee's speech at the very beginning, the government imagines citizenship in all three ways. Researching how people use these three registers will naturally bring to the fore questions of change and agency, providing us with a better understanding of the topic in this period. I think there's no more pressing historical problem in modern British past than citizenship. And I think the Cold War is a big part of the story, but it is only a part. I'm not going to sit here and say it's all the Cold War. And I think we need a general assault on the history of citizenship, and because I think that's really emerging as the core of the history of the modern Britain after 45. And that's it.